Hey guys, somewhere in upstate New York there's a long, quiet stretch of still water that most people drive right past without a second thought. But 200 years ago, this unremarkable ditch changed the entire economic future of the United States, and almost nobody wanted to build it. Thomas Jefferson called it madness. The federal government refused to pay for it, and yet a few stubborn men with shovels and an idea started digging anyway. This is the story of the Erie Canal, and why the most boring piece of water in America quietly built the most powerful city on Earth. To understand how that happened, we need to go back to the very beginning. The year was 1817, and the state of New York was thinking about a ditch. Not a dramatic trench, not a military fortification, just a long, slow, very deliberate ditch, stretching roughly 363 miles across the northern part of the state from the city of Albany all the way to Buffalo, connecting the Hudson River to the shores of Lake Erie. It was a practical idea, an unglamorous idea, and for most of the people who heard it discussed in the early years of the 19th century, it was also an idea that seemed almost impossibly large. But the men who championed it were patient men, and patience, it turned out, was exactly what the project required. The story of the Erie Canal begins, as so many American infrastructure stories do, with geography. The eastern seaboard of the United States in the early 1800s was separated from the interior of the continent by a long, formidable wall of mountains. The Appalachians ran from Georgia all the way up through New England, and crossing them with heavy goods, barrels of flour, bolts of fabric, crates of iron tools, was slow and expensive and exhausting. Merchants and farmers in the interior had products they wanted to sell, and merchants on the coast had products the interior needed. But the mountains sat between them like a problem nobody had quite solved yet. There was, however, one natural break in the mountains. In the state of New York, a low valley ran westward from the Hudson River, passing through what would eventually become the cities of Utica and Syracuse and Rochester. The Mohawk River carved this path, and the land on either side of it was relatively flat compared to the terrain south of it. People had noticed this opening for a long time. The Haudenosaunees, the people of the Iroquois Confederacy, had travelled these routes for centuries before any European set foot on the continent. Fur traders had used the valley, soldiers had moved through it, but no one had yet figured out how to turn that natural corridor into something that could carry the weight of commerce on a truly large scale. That was the idea behind the canal. A canal would do something that roads could not. It would allow boats to float heavy loads without the friction and difficulty of wagon wheels on rough terrain. Horses walking alongside a towpath could pull barges far heavier than any wagon team could haul. The math was compelling. On a good road, a team of horses might pull a wagon carrying perhaps a ton of cargo. On a canal, that same team could move a barge loaded with 30 tons or more. The difference was so significant that anyone who understood it tended to become an enthusiastic supporter of the project almost immediately. DeWitt Clinton was the most prominent of those enthusiasts. The workforce that built the Erie Canal was drawn from many places. Some workers were local farmers who needed seasonal employment. Many were recent immigrants, particularly from Ireland, who had arrived in the United States with little money and a willingness to do hard physical labour. There were also workers from other states, drawn by wages that were slightly better than what they could earn elsewhere. At the peak of construction, estimates suggest that around 9,000 men were working on various sections of the canal at any given time. Clinton was a politician. He served as mayor of New York City and later as governor of the state, and he had the kind of confidence that allowed him to advocate loudly for expensive and uncertain undertakings. He believed, with genuine conviction, that a canal connecting the Hudson River to the Great Lakes would transform New York into the commercial center of North America. He argued this case in speeches. He argued it in pamphlets. He argued it to skeptical members of the state legislature and to doubtful federal officials. Thomas Jefferson, when presented with the idea, reportedly called it a little short of madness. The federal government declined to fund it. Clinton pushed ahead anyway. In 1817, the New York state legislature approved funding for the canal and construction began. The starting ceremonies were held in Rome, New York, a small town near the middle of the planned route, on the 4th of July. There were speeches, there were cheers, and then, after the ceremony ended, several thousand workers picked up their tools and began to dig. The workforce that built the Erie Canal was drawn from many places. Some workers were local farmers who needed seasonal employment. Many were recent immigrants, particularly from Ireland, who had arrived in the United States with little money and a willingness to do hard physical labour. There were also workers from other states, drawn by wages that were slightly better than what they could earn elsewhere. At the peak of construction, estimates suggest that around 9,000 men were working on various sections of the canal at any given time. The work itself was demanding in ways that are somewhat difficult to convey without experiencing them directly. Workers dug by hand using picks and shovels. They cut through tree roots and rock and dense clay. They moved enormous quantities of earth one shovelful at a time. In the summer, they worked in heat and humidity, and clouds of mosquitoes rose from the wet ground around them. In the spring and fall, they worked in mud. Some sections of the route passed through swampy areas where the ground was soft and treacherous, and workers had to be careful about where they stepped. Illness was common. Malaria was a particular problem in the marshy sections of the western route. Despite these difficulties, the work proceeded steadily. The engineers who designed the canal, most of them self-taught, since there were almost no formally trained civil engineers in the United States at the time, developed new techniques as they went. They invented a device for pulling up tree stumps that used a large wheel and a long cable and could uproot a stump in a fraction of the time it would have taken a crew of workers with axes. They developed a hydraulic cement that would set and harden even when wet, which was essential for building the locks and aqueducts that the canal required. Locks were one of the canal's most important features. The landscape between Albany and Buffalo was not perfectly flat. In fact, there was a total elevation change of about 570 feet between the Hudson River at sea level and the surface of Lake Erie. To move boats up and down this elevation change, the engineers designed a series of 83 locks, chambers where boats could float in, and the water level could be raised or lowered to move the boat up or down to the next section of the canal. The locks were built from carefully cut stone, and each one had to be precisely constructed to ensure that the wooden lock gates would seal properly, and that the water management mechanisms would work as intended. The most dramatic engineering challenge on the entire route was the Niagara Escarpment, a long limestone cliff near the western end of the canal that dropped about 60 feet in a relatively short horizontal distance. Getting boats up and over this escarpment required a series of 5 locks in very quick succession, packed together tightly near the town of Lockport. The construction at Lockport involved cutting a channel through solid rock, which took enormous amounts of blasting powder and enormous amounts of manual labour. But it was accomplished, and the locks at Lockport became one of the engineering marvels of early 19th century America. In October of 1825, the canal was declared complete. The opening ceremonies stretched over several days and were genuinely elaborate. Governor DeWitt Clinton, whose advocacy had been so central to the canal's creation, travelled from Buffalo to Albany, and then down the Hudson River to New York City in a boat called the Seneca Chief. The boat carried 2 kegs of water drawn from Lake Erie. When the flotilla arrived in New York Harbor, Clinton poured the lake water into the Atlantic Ocean in a ceremony that was called the Wedding of the Waters, a symbolic joining of the inland lakes to the sea. Cannons fired in sequence along the length of the canal route to relay news of the opening. The sound of each cannon prompted the next one to fire, so that a signal could travel from Buffalo to New York City in roughly 80 minutes, using a chain of artillery pieces spaced along the route. This was considered a remarkable demonstration of speed, at a time when written messages still moved at the pace of a galloping horse. The canal opened for commerce almost immediately, and the effects were felt quickly. The cost of shipping a ton of goods from Buffalo to New York City dropped dramatically. Before the canal, the overland journey had cost around $100 per ton and taken about 3 weeks. After the canal opened, the same journey cost about $10 per ton and took around 8 days. These numbers changed the economics of the entire region in ways that were visible almost immediately. Farmers in Ohio and Indiana and the other inland states now had a cost-effective route to bring their grain and livestock products to eastern markets. The Port of New York, already the busiest in the country, became even more dominant. Land values along the canal corridor increased substantially. New towns grew up along the route. Cities like Rochester and Syracuse expanded with a speed that surprised even optimistic observers. Rochester, in particular, grew with unusual speed. Situated in the middle of the canal route near the Genesee River, Rochester had access to both water power for mills and transportation for the products of those mills. The city became a major flour milling center, turning the wheat grown on the farms of western New York and the Great Lakes region into flour that was shipped east through the canal. In 1820, Rochester had a population of about 1,500 people. By 1830, it had grown to more than 9,000. By 1840, it was close to 20,000. This rate of growth, sustained over 2 decades, made Rochester one of the fastest-growing cities in the country during that period. The success of the Erie Canal prompted a wave of canal building across the United States. Between the 1820s and the 1840s, states from Pennsylvania to Ohio to Indiana undertook ambitious canal projects, each hoping to replicate the economic success that New York had achieved. Pennsylvania built its own cross-state canal system, which included an unusual section where canal boats were loaded onto railway cars and hauled over the mountains on inclined planes. Ohio built the Ohio and Erie Canal, which connected the Ohio River to Lake Erie and opened up the interior of that state to commerce. Indiana built the Wabash and Erie Canal. Illinois planned an extensive system of canals connecting its rivers to Lake Michigan. Some of these projects were successful, many were not. The Pennsylvania system was expensive to build and difficult to operate, and it never achieved the profitability that its backers had hoped for. The Indiana canals were built during a period of overconfident expansion, and when financial panic struck in 1837 and again in 1839, the state of Indiana found itself deeply in debt and unable to complete or maintain its canal network. These financial difficulties contributed to a broader reckoning about the limits of canal building as an economic strategy. But in New York, the Erie Canal continued to function well and to generate substantial revenue. The tolls collected from canal traffic paid off the original construction debt within about a decade of the canal's opening. The canal continued to carry traffic profitably well into the middle of the 19th century. The canal did not stand still during this period. It was enlarged once, in a project that began in the 1830s and continued for many years, widening the channel and deepening it to accommodate larger boats carrying heavier loads. This enlargement was justified by the traffic volumes that the canal was carrying, which exceeded the original projections by a significant margin. The larger canal could handle bigger boats, which could carry more cargo, which made each trip more economically efficient for the boat operators. The character of the canal traffic changed somewhat over time as well. In the early years, the canal carried primarily agricultural goods, grain, flour, livestock, and timber, moving from the interior toward the eastern markets. As industries developed along the canal corridor, manufactured goods began to move in both directions. Coal from Pennsylvania mines, iron products from foundries in the Mohawk Valley, pottery and glass from factories in central New York. All of these found their way onto canal boats and into the commerce of the nation. The people who lived and worked on the canal boats had a life that was distinct from anything on land. Canal families, because many boat operators lived on their boats year-round, developed their own rhythms and customs. A boat moving at the standard canal speed of about 4 miles per hour would take roughly 8 days to travel the full length of the canal. The pace was slow enough that passengers could walk along the towpath and keep up with their boat without much effort. Children who grew up on canal boats often had limited access to schooling, and there were eventually efforts to create floating schools and other educational programs for canal children. The mules and horses that walked the towpath pulling the boats had their own particular lives as well. These animals worked in shifts, typically walking for several hours and then resting while another team took over. Canal towns developed a small industry around the care and supply of these animals, with stables and feed dealers positioned at regular intervals along the route. Low bridges were a constant feature of canal travel. The canal had to pass under hundreds of road bridges as it crossed the state, and many of these bridges were built quite close to the water's surface to minimize construction costs. Passengers riding on the roofs of canal boats, which was a common practice, had to duck or lie flat to avoid being swept off when the boat passed under a low bridge. The warning cry of low bridge became one of the characteristic sounds of canal travel, and it eventually found its way into a popular song about the Erie Canal that many people still know today. The canal was not without its difficulties and controversies. Arguments over water rights were common. Farmers whose fields were adjacent to the canal sometimes complained that the water table had been affected by the canal's presence, making their land wetter or drier than it had been before. There were disputes over the siting of locks and the allocation of water in dry seasons. The canal required constant maintenance. The earthen banks needed regular attention, the wooden lock gates needed replacement, and the channel itself needed periodic dredging to remove silt and debris. This maintenance work was ongoing and expensive. There were also periodic accidents. Canal boats sometimes ran aground or collided with each other in the narrow channel. Lock gates occasionally failed under the pressure of the water. Floods could damage sections of the canal banks, and in winter the canal froze solid, shutting down traffic entirely for several months each year. The winter closure was a significant limitation, since it meant that all the goods that needed to move could only travel for roughly 7 months out of 12. Despite these limitations, the Erie Canal remained an important commercial artery through the middle decades of the 19th century. It was only with the spread of railroads that the canal began to lose its dominant position. The first railroads in New York appeared in the 1830s, and they immediately demonstrated that they had some significant advantages over the canal. Railroads could operate in winter, railroads were faster, a train could cover the distance from Albany to Buffalo in a day, while a canal boat took the better part of a week. Railroads could be built in places where a canal was impractical, climbing grades that no canal could manage. The canal interests recognized the threat and fought back against it. For a period, the state of New York actually prohibited railroads from carrying freight in direct competition with the canal in order to protect the toll revenues that the canal generated. This restriction was eventually lifted as it became clear that the railroads were going to dominate freight transportation, regardless of the regulations. The New York Central Railroad, assembled in the 1850s from several smaller lines along the canal corridor, became the dominant transportation route between the Hudson River and the Great Lakes. The railroad followed roughly the same geographic corridor that the canal had pioneered, because the Mohawk Valley remained the most practical path through the mountains regardless of whether you were building a canal or a railroad, but it was faster and more flexible in ways that mattered greatly to shippers. Canal traffic declined through the second half of the 19th century. Not abruptly, the canal continued to operate and to carry substantial amounts of bulk goods like grain and coal, where the lower cost of canal transportation could still justify the slower speed, but steadily. The canal's share of the total freight movement in the state fell year by year as the railroads expanded their capacity and reduced their rates. By the end of the 19th century, serious questions were being asked about whether the Erie Canal had a future at all. The state of New York was spending considerable amounts of money on maintenance each year, and the toll revenues were no longer large enough to justify that spending easily. Some voices argued that the canal should simply be abandoned. Instead, the state chose to rebuild it. The Barge Canal, as the successor to the Erie Canal was called, was authorized by a state referendum in 1903 and took about 15 years to complete. It was a much larger waterway than the original Erie Canal, with a deeper channel and wider locks that could accommodate much bigger vessels. The old canal was largely incorporated into the new one, though in some places the route was changed to follow rivers and lakes rather than the artificial channel. Many of the old towpaths were abandoned, since the new Barge Canal was designed for motorized vessels rather than horse-drawn boats. The Barge Canal opened in 1918, during the final months of the First World War, and it did carry substantial commercial traffic in the decades that followed. Bulk goods like grain and petroleum products and construction materials moved through it in considerable quantities. But the canal never regained the economic dominance it had enjoyed in the early 19th century. The railroads were too efficient, and later, the trucking industry would provide yet another alternative. Commercial traffic on the canal declined through the 20th century, falling to very low levels by the 1990s. The last commercial grain boat made its passage through the canal in 1994. Today, the canal carries almost exclusively recreational traffic, pleasure boats, kayaks, tour boats, along a route that was once one of the most commercially significant waterways in the country. The physical infrastructure of the canal is still largely intact. The locks still work. The channel is still maintained. The state of New York manages the canal as part of a larger system of interconnected waterways, and there are ongoing discussions about the canal's future, as a recreational asset, as a potential component of freight transportation in some future, where the economics might shift again, and as a historic artifact of an earlier era. Along the length of the canal, in cities and small towns and rural stretches between them, the traces of the canal's history are everywhere if you know where to look. The remnants of old lock walls built from carefully cut stone still stand in some places, moss-covered and slowly weathering. Former canal towns have historic districts where the commercial buildings from the canal era still line streets that once ran parallel to the waterway. Museums in cities like Syracuse and Rochester preserve artifacts from the canal's working years. Old photographs, sections of lock equipment, the kinds of everyday objects that accumulated on canal boats and in canal towns over the decades. The human stories attached to the canal are mostly quiet ones. The workers who dug it left few written records. The families who lived on the boats rarely had the leisure to write detailed memoirs. What survives is fragmentary. A few journals, some letters, official records that tracked tonnage and toll revenues, but not the texture of daily life. Historians have pieced together what they can from these fragments, and there is something melancholy about the incompleteness of the record, given how many thousands of lives were shaped by the canal's existence. What the canal accomplished, in its working decades, was a significant reorganization of the geography of American commerce. It made New York City the dominant port of the eastern seaboard. It opened the interior of the continent to a level of commercial activity that would not otherwise have been possible at that time. It encouraged settlement and development along its corridor, and contributed to the growth of cities that are still major centers today. The engineers who built it, largely without formal training, figured out solutions to problems that had never been solved before in this country. The workers who dug it transformed a political vision into physical reality through years of sustained manual labor. The merchants and farmers who used it made decisions about where to live and what to plant and what to sell based on what the canal made economically possible. None of this was dramatic in the way that battles or political crises are dramatic. The canal was built slowly, over 8 years, and it functioned slowly, moving boats at the pace of a walking horse through a landscape that was gradually becoming more settled and more productive. Its effects accumulated over decades rather than revealing themselves in sudden transformations. But the accumulation mattered, and the ditch, the long, slow, very deliberate ditch that people once called a little short of madness, turned out to be one of the more consequential construction projects in the history of the country. The water in the canal today is dark and still in the early morning, before any boats have passed through. Herons stand in the shallows near the edges. Frogs call from the vegetation along the banks. The old stone lock walls where they still stand are covered in lichen and fern. The canal is quiet now in a way it wasn't for most of its history, and that quietness has a quality to it. Not abandonment exactly, but rest. The world that built the canal and depended on it has been gone for a long time. The urgency that drove its construction, the calculations of cost and distance and profit that shaped its design, the daily routines of the people who worked it and travelled it and lived beside it, all of that belongs to an earlier chapter of the country's story. What remains is the water and the stone and the long green corridor running across the state of New York, following a path that humans first recognized as useful several centuries before anyone dug a single shovelful of earth along its length. The canal is still there, in other words. It's just quieter now, and the boats, when they come, move slowly.